My name is Angelina Avedano, and this is Interspace, where we explore the spaces between us. Join me for discussions on a series of realities with thinkers, writers, thought leaders, and artists. Dr. Nicola Tannion is an academic, spiritual teacher, writer, and bridge builder with international presentation and teaching experience. She draws upon wisdom from the deep wells of the ancient ancestral mysteries, world mythologies, and the collective unconscious. Nikki's approach is a soothing elixir for the wounded world and affords her access to individual, environmental, and collective imbalances and suffering. Hi, Nikki. I want to welcome you to Interspace, and I have to say it's been several years since we first met. I was trying to remember if it's like 5 or 6 years ago, maybe 7, that we had our first conversation. And over the course of those years, I think we've only had maybe 4 or 5 actual physical conversations, but I feel such a connection with you. So I'm really glad that we get to have this conversation today and pick up where we left off. So welcome to Interspace.
Thank you. Thanks very much for the invitation.
And the reason that I would so want to talk to you is in large part due to the grief work that we're both doing in our lives now. But we also are very involved with stories, story making, meaning making, rituals, and mythology. So I'm just looking forward to a very rich discussion. I was looking at your website, and you describe yourself as a guide, a speaker, and a bridge builder. And I just wanted to say, just have you kind of say a little bit about the work that you're doing. And I'm really intrigued by this description as a bridge builder. And how do you see yourself as a bridge builder in the world today?
They're really good conversations. It's hard to think about the archetypes that are kind of present in our life. And bridge builder came up because I feel like the work I do a lot is between this world and the other world. So for people who have passed over, or the unseen world. My doctoral research was on ancestral connection, ancestral resonance within Irish culture, and how that kind of doesn't leave once you are generationally away from the homeland, but it's a way of being in the world, right? And so then the bridge building also comes between this very intuitive, mythic, organic way of being in the world that sees the soul in everything, right? And that traditionally Western culture doesn't see soul in, the earth, the plants, the animals, the creatures. And so I feel like I'm this bridge between this world and the other world, but also between this world and the other world and this world. So both ways, and different forms. So whether it's kind of very energy work and academics, or grief and corporate. So I feel like I kind of bridge these several worlds, and try to how do I bridge that? How do I bridge what would typically be thought of as two realms that have a divide? Mm-hmm. So that's kind of how I see myself.
That's yourself as a bridge builder. Can you tell me how you first became interested in doing this ancestral resonance work that you spoke of?
So the very first, this is a long been part of my life. So the very first kind of connections I had with my ancestors was when I was about 12 years old. And trying to make sense of that, knowing that what I was not on a regular basis, but seeing or hearing from a world that wasn't physically tangible, and kind of understanding very quickly that's not typically how people are in the world. Don't speak about that or you will be pathologized. But actually, so to kind of be working in that world really from when I was about 12 and starting to make sense of it. And the experiences became clearer, more articulable. Then when I moved from Australia to England, I did some training in massage energy work, and I learned how to at least describe it. And so that gave me a little bit more kind of concrete. It wasn't so ethereal. It gave me something concrete to discuss. And I've kind of really just gone from there. Mm-hmm. So really since I was 12, a long time.
And was there something about the process in the research and the dissertation work as you went through that journey that really surprised you in the end? Or did it really come through the way you thought it would?
It surprised me because, I grew up in Australia with no family other than my parents. My parents were first immigrants. I'm a first generation Australian. And we grew up with no family other than other immigrant families within Irish culture. And then very quickly from when I was like 5, I went to, so my mother's English and my father's Irish. And then I lived with my mum and my stepfather, both English. And so none of this was ever talked about. It was never talked about. Mythology was not part of my growing up. Understanding culture was not part of my growing up. So really it was my Irish great-grandmother that kind of directed me towards Pacifica, directed me towards mythology, and ultimately ended up kind of becoming, in part, the focus of my research. Not her specifically, but that kind of realm. And so there was a lot of surprises doing the research, doctoral research, because I learned about history I knew nothing about. I learned about ways of being in the world that are very typically indigenously Irish, that are not typically otherwise found in white Western culture. And so things that I was finding out started making a lot more sense about my lived experiences that had no grounding in knowledge. So really the experiences came first, the reading and the research came second, and then there was almost like a confirmation. It was like, oh, okay, this makes sense. I'm not the first kind of person who's experienced this. And so that added a lot of depth and a lot of kind of integration and confirmation about what I'd been feeling and experiencing over years.
Mm-hmm. So it really became not only a professional endeavor, but a personal journey, as it does for most of us.
Correct. And I think also it's not just about, I think there's the thing with mythology and depth psychology where the experiences in the world need to be brought into that academic frame rather than just the other way around. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right? It's not that I needed a PhD per se, but also this subject needed to be recorded in the academic realm.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Exactly. Also, I see that when you work with individuals, one of the things that you do is encourage and help them to develop a non-traditional form of knowing and wisdom, which I think is rooted in this work that you're doing and your own experience in yourself. But would you say a little bit more about these non-traditional ways of knowing and wisdom?
Yeah, I mean, and we can find them in mythology as well, which is, Veritas, Metis. So Metis, being the kind of first wife of Zeus, was swallowed and left banished. We hardly hear about her in mythology. And so really we all have this kind of deep intuitive knowing. It's our sixth sense. And we've been taught, especially as women, to ignore it. I mean, there's a long history of that being persecuted, witches being burned, knowing about plants and animals and how to use them medicinally were deemed, women and men who used that wisdom were burnt at the stake or outcast from the community. But it seems to be okay if it's called gut knowledge, and it's used in a boardroom or as a business decision. It's somehow okay when it's masculinized. And so it's really to get people in touch with their own deep knowing, but also, so that's one form within the self, but to see the signs and symbols in the world around them, to start articulating, to understand, start seeing them. For some people, it's just to start seeing them and then start noticing who and what shows up, and to kind of
maybe trusting that information.
Trusting the information, yeah.
Another thing that you mentioned as one of your missions is guiding individuals through the current paradigm shift. And I'm really interested in having this part of the conversation because I think it gets us to where we are today and the grief that we are collectively experiencing. But I think this paradigm shift is also bigger than that. And I wondered if you might speak to that a little bit.
So the paradigm shift that I'm seeing has been in process for a number of years, right? It's definitely been in process where we are at a turning point in humanity, and it's not just in cycles as in the year over year that we normally experience. This is a complete paradigm shift. And what I'm seeing is probably best recognized in terms of what's going on in popular culture. And so that's one place to at least ground it and see it. But what I really see is the dismantling of these very old patriarchal structures and the rise of a more integrated system. I know some people hope, okay, we're moving back to a very matricide culture. That is not what's coming. It's really the sacred conjunctio. This is the point. What we have at least the opportunity as human beings is to kind of rise up collectively and integrate and start integrating all that which has been suppressed by our culture. So anything that represents the other has been, this year has kind of risen anything that's been suppressed by the culture up into our consciousness, on the streets, in the government, on film, right? In many, many different forms. So others, anybody who's fallen under other, LGBTQI, gender identity, different ethnicities, immigrants, all those issues have been risen to the surface so that we have the opportunity to face that within the culture, they have been pushed aside, right? They have been banished to the other realms, right? And so there's a lot of grief with that because some people want to push down, and there's grief on both sides. The other wants to be seen, it has to be acknowledged, it has to be integrated, right? And there are people who really don't want that. So this is where this kind of tension and grief struggle comes in that I see.
Yeah, I think you do a really nice job too of pointing out. I know you're doing some very focused workshops and teaching on grief in extraordinary times this year.
Yeah.
And one of the things you point out in that work is helping individuals to identify death and non-death loss in their lives.
Correct.
And this is kind of what you're speaking about here.
Yeah, I think typically grief has been always considered around death, loss. And that's one area. The piece of grief that doesn't get talked about is non-death loss. Mm-hmm. And that's both personal and collective, right? And so on a personal level, we have a very hard time in Western culture, white Western culture especially, about not dealing with grief. Mm-hmm. And so depending on how we were raised, grief can be, completely shunned. Grief from death loss and grief from non-death loss. So first of all, just getting people to understand, what were the first losses you experienced in your life? Were they death loss or were they non-death loss? Were they through the loss of an animal, or were they because your parents divorced? Did you have to change schools? Was it a friend moving away? So there's all types of initial losses that we have that are non-death loss, and how our primary caregivers speak to those, mirror those, help us hold those, help us make sense of those, or not.
Right.
Trickles through our life and how we deal with loss. So there's usually a mirror for people between how they deal with grief today and what they learned about grief and those very early experiences. You know, and non-death loss can be just as profound as death loss.
Yeah. And I think that's what we're seeing today. Yes, we are certainly confronting death loss, and in extraordinary numbers, and the fear of death. But the amount of non-death loss that doesn't get articulated or processed or even acknowledged in any way is just astronomical. And I think what is creating a huge amount of anxiety, at least in the circles that I'm working in, and as I observe people in my professional life, my students, and many of them don't even realize where that's coming from.
Right, because we don't talk about it. And it starts, I think, in part because it's multiple. I think there's multiple strands to this, but we have become so disconnected from the bodies of our loved ones when they pass away that it has been made clinical. It's been stripped from the hands of the family. So in Ireland, you know, the women of the family or community would come and tend the body for death. The body would be laid out on what was called a waking table. And we're talking just one generation ago, like in my father's generation. And the body would lay in the house for 3 days. There would be rituals performed. People could touch the body, kiss the body. So there was a connection to death that has been removed from us. We do not have that experience. It's been, so now we fear death. You know, we fear death greatly. And that's because we don't talk about it. We don't have those experiences anymore, which over and over ground in our somatic system that life is impermanent. And so it has become feared. It's become, definitely feared. I mean, this is why this kind of staying young culture and youth culture is so held up here, especially in America, because fear and aging and the aging process scares the life out of people. Yet we are impermanent, right? Mm-hmm. So from that then stems our inability to talk about loss. It's usually minimized quite. That's what I've experienced in personal, but also in professional fields. Yeah.
I want to refer to a piece that you wrote. By the way, your writing in your blogs is just absolutely stunning. And
Thank you.
I always feel it's just very rich, very descriptive. You're a wonderful storyteller. In your most recent post, it's entitled Birthing the Future Presently. You suggest that how we journey through pain is up to us. Mm-hmm. And I want to tap into your knowledge on grief and loss and trauma that you've been talking about to expand a little bit more about this journey through pain and the birth metaphor that you use and the connection there. Because I think what you said is really profound, that we've been disconnected from death in the same way that we've been many times disconnected from the birthing process, and that those were the women's arenas or those circles that generally took care of those life and death processes. So that might be a really good place for us to go.
Yeah, I mean, they're connected, aren't they? At the moment we are born, if we make it out the passage, we are condemned to death. So they are inextricably linked. And to your point, we've removed both aspects from our everyday life, right? And so how do we journey through pain? And I use that birth metaphor because for some, and I, you know, the metaphor is in part, I don't want to put that just on women. I think this is so to take it back, how we've been taught to deal with pain in this culture is to be drugged, either not, you know, literally drugged, or to numb ourselves through screens or film or food or alcohol, right? Or busyness. Mm-hmm. We numb ourselves because, gosh, what do we do with pain? To sit with it, it's intense, and we haven't been taught how to hold these intense moments. And so, you know, we can ask for drugs. That's one way to journey through this pain. It's one way to journey through the transformation. We can completely numb out, right? We'll see it on the other side. That's for the people who are waiting for it to go back to normal. They're just kind of numbing because there is not going to be a normal pre-2020 in the same way. Mm-hmm. Or another way we can do is to drop into our somatic system, to sit in the body and to drop into that deep space. And in the center of that, if we're able to drop into our somatic being, there is usually silence and wisdom in that pain. Right, that is otherwise not gleanable when we're intellectualizing it or we're trying to avoid it.
How does this manifest, Nikki, on a collective level?
So I think there are, I think in the similar way, there are a lot of people who are very consciously holding the pain and suffering that is in this world right now. Right, it becomes, you asked about the collective body. It's many, many bodies becoming one body to kind of help hold that collective, right? It's not just me sitting here. I know there are other people in my city. There are people in your city. There are people in other parts of the world. And so energetically, it becomes a collective that is first of all, witnessing, acknowledging, feeling. And in that witnessing and feeling, there's a transformation that happens. In the witnessing of suffering, in the witnessing of grief, it is held. And when it is held and it is seen, it can transform in and of itself. It's energy. It's just energy. Mm-hmm. Right? And so it's not necessarily easy, not everybody's task, but there is a number of people who are sitting with this somatically and allowing that grief and suffering that is in the world, as in on a world surface, human beings, but also the transformation that's taking place in the earth itself, in the atmosphere, in the climate. Mm-hmm. So these things coming together.
Mm-hmm. And you said that there's a lot of individuals who are consciously doing that, holding that. And then there are a lot of individuals who are reacting unconsciously to the same thing. And I want to talk a little bit about that and spend some time there, because I think it's really important for people to understand how these energy flows, or however you want to describe it, that we're all navigating on a daily basis. They come into your space, emotional space. They even come into your physical space. Sometimes I feel like a wave of something coming through just as I'm working or in a Zoom meeting, right? Mm-hmm. And when I get into a space with individuals, even remotely, or walking into a classroom or a workshop, or, whatever you're doing, going to the grocery store, right? Mm-hmm. And, if we are not consciously aware of what it is that is around us, we can easily be like upended and feel like we're losing our minds because of the intensity all around us. I think people are really struggling with that. At least the people I am speaking with are. And could we talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think there's a really good, a place to start with that is asking ourselves, is this mine or is this not mine? Was I fine 5 minutes ago before I walked in the grocery store? Yeah, I was. Okay, so this is actually in the broader, in that collective. And so first is about being aware. And some people aren't, as you said. But I think people are reacting. They might be reacting unconsciously, but they're reacting to something in the collective. So, and that can be both ways, right? That can be like the resistance against or alignment towards. And so when people start acknowledging, so as you, somebody who deals with a lot of people, a lot of students, a good place to start is to say, is this yours? Was this yours 5 minutes ago? Was this how you were feeling 5 minutes? Is this how you woke up feeling this morning? Anything in your life that would be triggering this? No. Okay. Then it helps people kind of place themselves, get grounded within themselves and recognize this is external in the larger field. And the other place I'm really kind of encouraging people to do is stand with no shoes on the earth. Reconnect ourselves to the magnetic field that is the earth, that is mirrored in ourself. And I could go into more detail about that different connection that we have. But we've become literally disconnected from the earth we are on. Our clothes, our shoes, our electronics, it gets in the way. It's interference. Right? And that then becomes noise, and that then is also disruptive to people and to people's spheres and fear.
Yeah, there's a kind of neurobiology, there's a neurobiological connection here that we oftentimes dismiss or that we're not aware of, that we're navigating at all times.
Yeah, and it's not just neurobiological. We actually have electromagnetic field around our heart that radiates out up to 12 feet in the shape of a toroidal field, which is more like a donut shape. And it's the exact same electromagnetic field that's around the planet.
Yeah.
So our hearts and planet are connected. And so when we have people come within that 12 feet sphere of us, their heart space, their heart energy can absolutely disrupt what's going on for us personally.
Yeah, there's. I'm sure you're aware of it based on what you're saying. The information at the Heart Math Institute is very fascinating, documenting the science around this, which I get very excited about. The science backing up what we've all felt on a spiritual level. I get very excited that those two are starting to come into alignment now.
Yeah. I'm curious as to, I'm kind of curious about that because part of me is very excited. Yes, great science is catching up. And there's going to be, and it's kind of like, well, there was a lot of damage done before science caught up and proved what was indigenous cultures have already known for centuries and centuries. So there is going to, suddenly it's okay now because science proves it. So there's this dichotomy, there's this kind of, balance that needs to happen, I think, with that. Right?
I hear you. There has been such a dismissive attitude around those other ways of knowing that you talked about.
Right.
And now here it's like, now we're going to put our seal of approval on it. However, one of the things that I get excited about is that perhaps that information will reach people who otherwise would not have opened themselves to it now.
Correct. And I agree with you. And I think that's one of the shifts that's happening in the collective, right? And so we were looking at, what are those shifts that are happening? How are they showing up? And it is that science is now aligning, proving, confirming what was traditionally indigenous or other ways of knowing, mapping the brain, mapping brain activity around Buddhist monks, Dalai Lama. I know Georgia State University's been doing experiments and research around that and looking at how that happens. So yes, that's definitely one of the shifts that's occurring for sure.
Yeah, there's a connection here with it. It's an interesting segue because there's a connection here between shift in perspective and the birth metaphor that you used in your piece, Birthing the Future, presently, where you talk about your grief passage, or the transformation process that you're talking about. You talk about it one way. I describe this as the mother odyssey, but this birth, as you say, is a, quote, reorganization of these foundational structures that we're talking about, which means that we will have to change our thinking, behavior, and entitlement. This is a quote from your blog. But I want to talk a little bit more about this change in this radical shift in perspective.
So how do I see that manifesting? What do I see? What is the shift?
I think it's exciting to think about that birth metaphor in this shift that we're talking about and how those two overlap as we are changing our thinking, our behavior, our entitlement. I mean, we were just recently talking about the science community, but this is happening there too. And it's a birth metaphor that's kind of applied to this shift in consciousness.
Well, I think it's to use the metaphor. I mean, I love the Mother Odyssey when I read that's how you term it, because it is a whole Odyssey, which means it's not just in one part. The Odyssey itself is this long journey. And so to use your metaphor, I see us having started this shift many years ago, right? I'm not going to put a figure on it, but I would at least a couple of decades. It's coming to that point where it's been in utero of itself. It's been forming in the unconscious, and now that point of crowning, we are going to have to reorganize this gap between people who have and people who are on the streets, people who are eating today and people who are not eating today. We cannot, we can continue like this, but this will not be good for humanity. We have to have a radical shift. And grief is so tied into that because we have to begin shifting. Well, who am I to have all else above somebody else? Who am I? And hopefully, there's pain in that witnessing. There's pain in that letting go of entitlement for some people. There's pain in and suffering in that. But the Odyssey is a brilliant word because it indicates it's not just happening now. It's a long process. Right?
Yeah, and I think it's also I think it can, just like grief. It doesn't, you process through, there are different phases, but I don't know that I feel like that when you start the Mother Odyssey, a grief passage, you're on that throughout your lifetime. You certainly come through to clearings on the path, but you have been transformed or are transformed or are in the process of transformation, being transformed through that journey. It's not like you're going to get there. You're not going to get somewhere.
I totally agree. And I think this is where another piece to bring in myth. I go back to the myth of Persephone. She was pulled into that underworld unwillingly to begin with. But what she does is she doesn't just remain there, nor does she just come out. Right, which is separate from Inanna, who went in very consciously, had to let go of those stages, came back out and as transformed. Persephone goes down. She goes back into the grief. She goes back into the darkness. And each spring she comes back up. And in my imagination, she shares what she has learned while she was there. She gathers her friends who were in the field picking those narcissus flowers. And she shares what she has learned while she was in the grief process. So there is no kind of end in that, to your point. It's cyclical. Sometimes, it's deep and we come back up, and sometimes we go back down, but not as deep as the very first time we went down. Kind of know what we're getting into when it comes back around, right? We know at least what it feels like. And so there's much more consciousness that comes with it.
Yes,
right?
Absolutely. I also really loved, in part of the conversation you were having about this process, is the you bringing up the midwives of change as instigators, guides, and I just wanted to talk about these midwives to the process.
And what specifically would you like? Because it resonates for you, because you are one as well.
Well, I do feel like that being aware of the process and, as you say, just helping others. How did you put it? Navigate, guiding individuals through the paradigm shift. That is a midwife. That's the process.
Yes.
But I thought you did an interesting thing where you said there's various types of midwives. There's those that instigate and kind of hold our feet to the fire and say, things must change. There needs to be action, and it needs to be decisive. And it's almost like a brutal kind of in your face sort of presence. And then there are other midwives. This is another kind of energy that is like nurturing and kind of working you through this gently, helping you maybe process the feelings. I mean, this is kind of what I took away from it, that you have this the midwiving process or the facilitation or, help holding space for individuals can take on a variety of appearances.
Absolutely. And that's I think the thing with, we are all individuals. This process is individual. This process is dynamic and transformative. And there's, as that baby's crowning, to use a birthing metaphor, we don't need a midwife who says, it'll be okay. We need a midwife who says, push now. This is the moment, right? And so we have to, for those of us who are guides to that process, we have to basically understand when to nurture, when to push. And some of us do one better than the other. And there are other people who will come in, right? So it's not just that we're going to have one midwife facilitating change for one individual or a group or the collective, but there are various midwives of various shapes and sizes and colors and genders, and they will each be doing their part in that. Each has a very important part to play, depending on when that timing is.
Yeah. Nikki, I guess I have to ask, when you look at where we are in the process of this coming shift, impending, imminent transformation, do you have hope for our planet?
If you'd asked me this in January or June or August, I would have said no. I really was very deep in that process and place of profound loss and hopelessness. I do have hope, but I think it's still very delicate. I think it is still very delicate. It's not quite certain which direction we're we're heading. I mean, we can see it coming. Some of us can see it coming. We can see things within popular culture. We can see signs, if you will, that there is hope, that we're moving forward. But it's still this pulling back that says, we're not going there. We're not going to let this happen. So I'm hopeful of the signs I see. I'm not certain that it's going to manifest.
I want to pause there for a minute before we go to too far with the hope, because you said something really important, and just that there is a lot of grief and concern, and I felt that too. I felt a real sense of, earlier in the year, just tremendous disappointment and sadness and loss. I remember on election night, just being overwhelmed by a wave of grief that I felt like a child. I felt like a child kind of when you first realize there's no Santa, right? Or it was just like I felt this wave of the idealized vision of what democracy and national sovereignty and this idealized version of something noble, a noble kind of respect, and that I just kind of felt disillusioned and like I had lost something really, really profound in the process. And then, I kind of had to sort of snicker to myself, because I thought, well, I'm not necessarily sure that was there to begin with, but it was my idealized childlike version, right? In my, having to let go of that. And this is at the root of, I think, so much of our sadness and loss, that we have to let go of everything.
Yeah. What I see, and I see this as an outsider insider. And so no matter which culture I've lived in, I've seemed to have been an outsider insider. And what I see here, I wasn't American born, obviously. But the story that's been told about America, that America tells about itself, is that they are the most dominant, powerful, enlightened nation on the planet. And part of what the last 4 years has been about is chipping away at that kind of very egocentric, overinflated egocentric view. It's a very young view. And it's only when we're tested. So this in itself is, the country itself is going through a birthing process. It's dying. What's dying is the myth it has about itself. And that's very hard to hold, because it's tied into personal identity, national identity, and it can't see itself also either, because what we're self-consumed, and this year especially, where we're not able to travel outside. So we're in the midst of it and can't quite really see what's happening. But from the outside looking in, it looks like America is consuming itself. And what it's consuming is the myth of this elite status as well, right? That very, and why I say that is it's a very young, overinflated egoic sense of identity and self. And so like through any of us, it's that teenage process of like, hey, I'm here and I'm the most important person in the world and in the room. And we know no teenager is, but we all feel it when we're a teenager. And so it's that shift. That's what I'm seeing anyway. And I just offer one perspective out of many, I'm sure.
Yes.
So
I think that's a really great way to describe that. But I want to come back a little bit, because for people who may not understand what you mean when you describe yourself as an insider or outsider, could you say a little bit more?
Yeah. I was born, my journey started in England. I was conceived in England. My parents left, emigrated to Australia while they were pregnant with me. I was born in Australia 8 weeks after arrival to immigrant parents. So I was raised in Australia, but of immigrant parents. Then I went, when I was 24, I went to live in England. So although I have familial roots there, I was never born there, never lived there. So they considered me an outsider. Traveling to Ireland. Well, I wasn't born in Ireland, even though my dad was. So I'm an outsider there, but I'm also an insider because I have family. And then coming to America, it's interesting because, you know, where am I from? And so I am American. I have become an American citizen. I did vote, and so kind of having these different perspectives because I've lived outside of America, was born outside of America, and for those kind of first, 35 years was not in America, right? So I have a very different perspective of it. And so I stand inside and outside. It's like that bridge building again, we talked about earlier.
Mm-hmm. So what you're saying is, and as you described it, you can see the country with a very different lens. You can see us from an advantage that those of us who've been here most of our lives can't really see.
In some ways, I think so, because I'm here and I'm immersed in the culture. I mean, I've been here since 2006. I didn't just arrive. So I'm understanding culture from, Pacific Northwest right down here, down to the Southeast. And so seeing these various different national identities also within this country. But the way that people would view Australians or the way that Americans would view English, right? We have perception of countries outside. And so I think there's one thing about looking at a country that you've never lived in and having an opinion versus when you're living here, but you're also from outside. So that's kind of what I'm meaning.
I think that as we are moving through this very challenging time, I want to talk a little bit because you do such beautiful work with stories, and I want to talk a little bit about how can these stories help us to move through the time that we're facing.
I think it's like with any storytelling or mythology, it's both archetypal and personal, right? So it's archetypal where it resonates across the collective. And so we find our own meaning in the myths and the stories for where we are for the place in which we are consciously aware at the time. We can go back and read myths over and over, and where we are developmentally or within our conscious journey, within our shifts, then we see different things within the mythologies or the stories. So while things can be personal, they're also archetypal. And so then they're accessible to anybody. So that's how I see them helping.
Yeah. And as you were going through this year, and you said, you went through several months where you didn't have a lot of hope for the future. Was there a story that comforted you or that came to you in a way that gave you some kind of, resonance?
No, I think I wasn't looking for stories of hope either at that time, though. I was really sitting with this deep reality of, gosh, we might not make it out at the end of this year as a species. And so I really wasn't looking particularly for stories of hope, but just somewhere in my being knowing that this is a point in time, right? And so we have been through, in our own grief journeys, we hit these moments which we never think we're going to come out of, and yet we come out of them. So I've had enough of those deep grief experiences and journeys in my life, which understanding, okay, I'm in the bottom of the grief well right now. what I call the grief well. And so I'm here, I can't see a way out necessarily. So once I recognize that, it's like, okay, what does help me exit the well? But stories in and of themselves, not necessarily at the time when I'm right in it, when I'm right in that place. I'm not sure if that's helpful or not, but that was the truth experience.
Yeah. And just for those who may be finding themselves sitting in that place and holding that space, whether they're doing it against their will or not, can you offer some kind of suggestion or support in just being with that much loss?
Yeah, I go back to my meditation teacher training and also understanding neurobiology around what does grief require. And so the first part, focusing on breath and the long exhale. We're always taught, take a deep breath in, but actually just something as simple, I teach meditation, something as simple as breathing into the count of 4 and exhale through the mouth for the count of 7 helps reorganize and recalibrate the nervous system in the body. The point I raised earlier about reconnecting with nature, putting our bare feet on the earth, spending time no matter how big that patch of earth is. So taking ourselves out from where we're currently sitting, right, and replugging into the earth, our ultimate mother, right, the planet that we're living on. So to go back to the earth for nurturing, and anything that creates movement, whether that's writing or dancing or walking or singing, anything that creates a movement is one way to kind of help shift and help transform and move through that grieving process.
What is happening there when you talk about this creation of movement? What is happening there?
Well, not all grief and loss is trauma related. But in trauma, we have a biological response, which is either flight or fight. If we can't fight or flight, if we can't exit, if the threat is too big, and let's be honest, the coronavirus has been too big. We couldn't see it. It's like we're fighting this unknown sniper that's just kind of waiting, right? So for people who have had trauma, for people who have had a lot of a loss and grief in their life, that can get immediately triggered into wanting to run away or wanting to try and fight it, right? And so that's what we're seeing in the collective is people resisting, they're fighting it, they're wanting autonomy, they're desperately trying to fight it, right? That's what's going on a biological level. So we think it's abstract, but actually they're reacting biologically to a threat, fight or flight. When that goes on for a longer period of time and we can't do those because the door's blocked, because the threat's too big, we do one of two things, which is freeze or fold. And so when we get kind of frozen and we're stuck in it, that can last for years for people. And so we can talk about that later. But that's kind of a secondary response to not being able to fight or flight. And so within that, we have to go back to what were the first two things. Fighting or flighting is all about movement. Mm-hmm. Freezing and folding is all about going inwards or staying still. Mm-hmm. And the one way to break that is to start doing that movement, to unfreeze, to unfurl ourselves in our grief, right? To unfurl it. And that could be very gentle, it can be gentle movements. It doesn't have to be, okay, I have to run for my life or I have to fight this big dragon. It can be like, okay, I find myself unable to move off the sofa today. Okay, I'm just going to take a walk. I'm just going to step outside my front door. I'm just going to put some music on. I'm going to put one song on. I'm the one song might create crying, you know, it might trigger us this crying, but crying is a movement, right? It's a process. It's an unfreezing of our initial shock reaction.
Mm. So that initial shock, and you has been so much, you know, those of us who've had trauma in our lives may not even realize that you talked a little bit about these triggers. And it's interesting, it's always interesting to me when I can get triggered by something and it may not look anything at all like anything that I recognize in my life. Like sometimes you can put the pieces together, right? Sometimes you can say, oh, well, that is very much like this. And this makes sense because of course I'm always one to try to intellectualize everything. So if A matches A, then I can put those pieces together. But sometimes it doesn't look anything like anything that I know that I have experienced. And yet I will still find myself triggered in a way that doesn't make rational sense. And I think many times right now, it's hard to know that that's what's happening, that you're having this trauma response. And some people don't even have a language for what that is.
No, a lot of people don't. And it comes back to that. I mean, just to touch back on that part of the conversation we had earlier about, you know, how our first grief was treated, was mirrored, was held, what we were told about it, the messaging we were told repeats and sets up these patterns. But we don't have, it is becoming more common in our culture, but not really. There's a lot more work to do to get people familiar to what are grief responses, what are trauma responses, and language that isn't just now becomes like the go-to, I had traumatic experiences. Mm-hmm. And so, right, which is kind of now like everybody's had that. But what are those deep, you know, experiences that really rock you to your core, that those true kind of experiences, which is, you know, taking you from all that was familiar, that makes you face or kind of has you face a brush with death or your own mortality. I mean, they're deeply profound, especially when they're repeated and repeated and repeated, especially like in childhood, right? And then what doesn't happen in our culture is that third step of coming back, of being seen as having gone through something absolutely profound. And so, you know, we don't do that with our true warriors. We don't do that with people who have been through trauma. So how is anybody else supposed to understand that language, right? And so to be a midwife of change is to give language, is to offer perspectives. It's to give, bear witness. It's to bear witness.
Yeah. I think too that as people are, you made a really good point that it's almost like trauma has become a new buzzword, and therefore it loses its value or its import when we overuse it in such a way. Not that that everyone doesn't have trauma, but it just becomes like something that you say without a connection to it. It's almost like you're not feeling it in your body. You're still just talking about it. And, and there is a real disconnect about learning how to feel the feelings around anything. And not just talk about them. And I don't think that we have, even a process or a guide or even a knowing that needs to happen in our culture.
So I wrote a piece called Earth Body, Human Body, and I was looking at the connection between what's happening on the planet, to the planet, and us. Everything that we have done to the planet, we are now having done in our own bodies and our own systems. So those unseen, we've kept animals in cages. We're all locked in our house, We've treated prisoners with, in a form. We've locked them in solitary confinement. We've put them in this, in this kind of specific space. We're now isolated. People are crying they can't go out for this unfair, unseen thing, right? So pollution, the way we've been treating the earth is now kind of infiltrating into our bodies in a way. So one of the opportunities that we have here is to get back in touch with our physical and somatic system. The longest journey we have is the journey from here to our heart space.
From the head space to the heart space.
From the head space to the heart space. And we're not taught to hold these difficult emotions. I mean, in Australia, sorry to Australia for saying this, but this is true. Growing up in Australia, it minimized any emotional difficulty, anything. So instead of comfort, the Australian model used to be, when I lived there, was you'll be right, get over it. So you could have lost your legs, you could have been a double amputee, and somebody would say, well, you've got your arms and you can still talk, can't you? Right? And so in a way, it's very much like keep going, you're still okay. But the missing piece is, yeah, crap, that's hard. You've lost both of your legs, you're a double amputee, things are going to shift for you profoundly. That piece gets missed out. Right. And so we have this disconnect because let's face it, it's painful sitting in pain. It's painful sitting in pain. And it goes back to that medicating or numbing because we're not taught. We don't have witnesses for that. We don't have somebody who in your conversation you had with Japhet that will witness.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And not try to fix it. Not try to move you, not try to just sit and be with it and witness your suffering. And
it's so really we try scary. It's a scary place to be.
It is a scary place to be, but we're not taught to build that muscle either when we're children. That's where it gets built. So we get to adulthood and we're suddenly supposed to know how to deal with death or profound grief or, the big emotions that are happening in the collective. Mm-hmm. All the protests that came up is anger. It's energy. It's a freeing of energy from this stuck and frozen place. So it can be overwhelming when we spend time in our heads as a way of processing and a way of kind of dealing with pain, making sense of it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I want to talk a little bit more about something you said about what's happening with the planet is happening with us. And I want to talk about this global wounding. Let's say it like that. This trauma that is global, that's planetary. And because there is definitely a connection. And we can argue, it's kind of, I don't know, am I being the teenager here who feels like humanity is the most important thing in the room? I don't know. But I can't help but think that we are mirroring, as you said, what we've done to the planet, we've done to ourselves. But not just in the, being locked away in a pandemic, but on so many levels of the way that it is manifesting in our mental health, the way that it is manifesting in our physical health. And we see this sort of mirroring of the micro and the macro, of the individual body, the cellular level, and the planetary systems. And I just want to talk a little bit more about that.
So what I see is we're a very now-centric people and a very now-centric generation. And not just generation, but as a culture. And we do not look at the consequences of what our actions are going to have on not just the next generation or the generation after that, but what about 7 generations ahead in time? Or 10 generations? And where I go with this is can be rooted in Indigenous culture and rooted in science. So Indigenous culture will make decisions. People in certain communities will make decisions based on what impact that decision is going to have for 7 generations yet to be born, right? And then we have science catches up and talks about epigenetics and how a trauma or traumas that happen in the collective can be passed down genetically 10 generations. We better start thinking about what we're doing now and how we're leaving the planet, how we interact with our non-human relatives. The plants have trees have a network underneath the earth. They talk to each other. They communicate with each other. There's an intelligence that takes not more than it needs. We're the only species that takes more than it needs. We're the only species that does not work in alignment with that which is around us and that which we're working with. And it can come from old mythologies, structures that says that man has dominance over the world. But that's not the only mythology, and it's not the only worldview. And the reckoning will come when we realize the earth will survive without human beings. Mm-hmm. Human beings cannot survive without the earth. They cannot survive without clean water. We cannot survive without air. So actually, we have been projecting our own vulnerability onto the planet for a long time. But the planet will be just fine.
That is such an important thing. Someone recently said it, and I wish I could remember who. Geology tells the truth, right? So geology tells the truth. The Earth will be just fine, and yes. We might not be fine. It may not need us at all to be fine, but the Earth will regenerate, because that's what the Earth does.
It's a regenerative force, right? And we don't know if we are the finite thing. We're the kind of finite things on the planet. Mm-hmm. The planet itself might be around way longer than any human being. Mm-hmm. We might have species that come after us. Mm-hmm.
I think the beautiful thing to think about, though, is that the Earth as that regenerative force is also within us. Right, we're a part of that, and we have that regenerative force too. If only we were truly connected to that, we could solve all of our problems in pretty short order.
I'm thinking it's that thing. It's move out of the head as our dominant space, move into our heart space, which automatically and energetically connects us back with our earth space. Mm-hmm. Spend time in nature, not for the sake of, being separate from nature, but this nuanced approach of understanding that we are an intimate part of and with nature.
Mm-hmm. Nikki, has your deep connection with the ancestral resonance work you do, how does that influence the way you see these connections playing out? How can other individuals, if they're interested, how does that ancestral resonance play into this connection between ourselves and the earth?
So on a very physical level, our earth is made up of billions of people who lived before. We're breathing air of our ancestors that contains our ancestors, that contains stardust. We grow our food in the soil that really comes and is part of our ancestors. We don't know who's buried in residential areas, in farming lands. We don't know who's underneath and who's kind of whose bodies and lives are part now of the earth itself. So there's that level on that kind of very, very grounded physical level. But also to know that we are living this, and I said that, we're living a life and an existence that we had no part in creating on some level, right? The world that we're living in today has there were things that started with the Industrial Revolution that have created us to sit where we are today. But what do we do going forward, right? The ancestors, I think, are here to kind of, and we can tap into them, we can use them as guides to help us kind of heal some of those lines that go backwards and to raise kind of awareness. When you start doing ancestral work, you very quickly realize, oh, hang on a minute, I am going to become an ancestor. So what legacy do I want to leave? I might not have children. I don't have biological children, but what legacy do I want to leave as an ancestor and a relative for my nieces and nephews and for the children who are here today? Right? Does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I was also thinking about, I love that, thinking about how everything that we partake in on a daily basis is connected on a cellular level. And as you were mentioning before about epigenetics, there's just a lot of overlapping conversations about that in the science community and in intuitive spiritual communities as well. So I think that's a really important thing to remember. And it's so easy to feel that the past is the past and we're so disconnected from that which we don't remember or that which we don't identify with. I'm also just wondering if, as people get in touch with their ancestors and their histories, just finding out that information, how does that help one to heal? Because there's a part of me that says, first of all, there's some trauma there that maybe I don't want to remember. And since I don't have the connection to that time and space or those individuals on maybe one side of my family or another, how does it even affect me? I'm not connected to it. So therefore, I'm just kind of moving forward in my life without those connections. And some people don't even know, right? They don't know the history and they don't know those connections. And I'm just wondering, what is the benefit and what is the, how working with that information brings you to a place of a deeper understanding of yourself and your own growth, when perhaps you don't, when perhaps there's some dark history there.
Yeah, that's a good question, because we're carrying it and we're carrying it. And what I mean by it is we're carrying their stories, their lived experience in our bodies 24/7, whether we realize it or not, whether we know it or not, whether we've never met them. We may never know our biological parents. We may never know our biological grandparents or great-grandparents or great-great-grandparents. But we come from, in 10 generations, I think it's something like 14,000 people. So we have stories within us that we're carrying with us that have been passed down, right? And so if you can find out about them, your ancestors, it helps form a place of understanding about ourselves. It helps us see patterns that we might be carrying on that no longer serve us or them, right? That we can be repeating without knowing, where does this come from, right? And it could be, my mother, my grandmother, my great-grandmother, my great-grandmother all kind of had a particular, pattern ahead of them, that they fell into. And for me, that it's very limiting. And probably my role might be to break that, right? So I think it can help us shift patterns, break patterns, become more understanding of our identity, more understanding of, to your point, before when you talked about this triggered you, but you had no intellectual connection, it might not be yours, right? You might be reacting to something that is in the familial line. So stories and understanding those kind of stories, at least on if it's not just personal history, what happened at the time when those people lived? Where did they live? What were the cultural expectations and norms of the time per gender or place within families? And that general information can give us a lot of new ways of processing and understanding ourselves, but also our triggers, what serves us, what doesn't serve us. It can show us where our gifts come from. What's a gift, where, what's a talent, what's an innate talent that we have? Oh, hang on a minute. That came from my grandfather. He was also a writer. So we may be able to make sense of, integrate those parts that need integrating, heal those parts that need healing, release ourselves and sometimes them, the ancestors themselves, from this bond, right, of repeated patterns. So I came in and knew at a very, very early age, and I had no idea at the time why I thought this, but this ends with me. Mm-hmm. And I kept saying that right from very young, ends with me, like very young. And, having gone through an enormous amount of complex interpersonal trauma in my early life, not understanding what the familial patterns were in that until much later, and realizing that there were some patterns, some intergenerational patterns, but also why I came in saying, it ends with me. And I'm here, I don't know about you, but I'm definitely hearing more and more people saying, oh, I know this kind of, I have to end something within my family. Or I just think I'm the stopping point here. I've heard people say that, but I don't know why. And I'm like, okay, let's explore that. Let's explore what that might be. What is it that you have come in to say no more in this line? Right?
Yeah, you have a term for that in one of your blogs, like you call it a generational legacy.
Yeah. Because we're carrying on a legacy. I mean, to the point, what kind of legacy do we want to leave? Well, we're living a legacy that somebody else left us. And so, we are this kind of axle point in the middle of between, the generations that have passed, our personal, the collective, the broader sphere of humanity. And we all have, when we say, oh, I'm from here, or from, my ancestors are from these locations, we carry that history with us, whether we're conscious of it or not. We might have more alignment to one side than the other. We might have more resonance, if you will, about the stories or the patterns that have emerged from one side or another. But they're both within us, especially if there's conflict within those systems, right?
I think you say at one point, human beings can do things that could make a butterfly turn into a raging dragon. And, but in that, which I love that description, by the way, but you also talk about in that piece that you've written about the hungry wolf inside of our souls. And I wanted to just touch on that a little bit, that will never let us rest. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. We have these aspects of ourselves that show up again and again and again. And it's our pattern, our wolf that tries to kind of take us out. And whether that is addiction or however we kind of do ourselves a disservice, wherever we're disconnect, that wolf is, right? And that's a part of our wounded ego, for sure. And it's to notice, how does that show up for us? Because we're all going to be different. It's going to show up different. Notice what it feels like when it shows up. That can be a first indicator. but also, twofold is, what does the wolf need to be satiated that might not be sacrificing of self? What can we do to feed it, right? That isn't sacrificial of ourself. Could we feed it art? Could we feed it music? Could we feed it movement? Could we feed it sleep? Right? What is it that it's asking for? Befriending and kind of putting that hungry wolf outside as an externalized archetype, we then can have dialogue with it, right? It takes it out of ourself and doesn't run amok in us without consciousness. So there's that kind of aspect as well, right? And it requires a deep surrendering, I think. An acknowledgement it exists.
Mm-hmm.
We can try and kill it, right? But it will come back.
Yeah, and the other thing that comes to mind is when you're saying that, you're talking about on a more individual level, but as our conversation has broadened into the national, the global, I'm thinking that wolf is much bigger. That's a very big wolf.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a wolf pack, right? There's a wolf pack, and some of it, but we can have wolf guides. We can have wolf guide. What does wolf represent? What does that kind of hungry ghost represent, i.e. the ancestors? What does, we have these metaphors which we can externalize, and they're looking to be fed. What are they wanting? Mm-hmm. And they're needing, to us to write another ending. They're needing to be fed. They're needing to be nurtured. They're needing to be witnessed, so that they don't get pressed to the, pushed to the underground. Mm-hmm. So they don't get kind of locked in a cage, because when it's locked in a cage, it becomes, it grows. How can we face it? What is it? What is it asking us, of us, individually, collectively? And it's kind of part of our weaving of our soul story and our soul blanket. Is it asking us to write another ending? Right now we're weaving our story of humanity. What story are we weaving?
I absolutely love that description about the metaphor of this weaving the soul blanket. And I really honestly can't think of a better way to close this conversation. That's so beautiful. As always, you just have so much imagery and connection in the way that you speak and the way that you write and your very presence. And I'm just always so privileged to get to spend time with you. I am just so happy that our paths got to commingle once more.
And mutual. Thank you very much. It's been wonderful. And it's just, anytime we come together, the conversation just goes right back to where it was. And we go forward. It's beautiful. Yes. So thank you for doing the work that you're doing and the opportunity you're presenting in the world.
Oh, and thank you so much. And I can't wait to see what the future brings, and hopefully we'll get to work together.
Mutual. Sounds good. Thank you, darling. Thank you.
If you would like to read more of Nicola's beautiful writing, you can find her blog, Piercing the Veil, on her website, www.nicolatannion.com. That's NICOLATANNION.com. Go there to find out about upcoming courses, workshops, and presentations. You have been listening to Interspace with Angelina Avadano. My heartfelt gratitude and appreciation goes to my husband, David Needs, Senior Production Engineer. If you would like to learn more about me or my work, look for me on Facebook and Instagram, Dr. A. Avadano with Cicada Personal Metamorphosis. That's Cicada with a Y, CYCADA. Or you can email me at dr.aavedano@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. This is Angelina reminding you that we're all connected.